the Traditional Press Podcast, where we talk traditional values, monarchy, family life, religion, war, economics, and what it means to be fully human. Sit back, sip tea, and enjoy yourself with me, your host, Jonathan Roberts. My first experience with the Shroud was kind of an uncomfortable one. The first interaction that I ever had with it was actually not with the original Shroud, but was with a issue of a secondary revelation from a person that I will simply call Sister P, who had said that she had received a vision of the incarnate Christ coming into her bedroom, as it were, who told her that she was supposed to perform certain specific religious ceremonies and worship services, worship actions, I should say, to the specific aspect of the Shroud of Turin, kind of known as, to the specific aspect of the Shroud of Turin that was just the face. And this particular individual had all kinds of trouble. Supposedly, the devil himself broke through the spiritual barrier, took on corporeal flesh, and beat her up, as well as throwing her down the stairs and burning certain religious things. And it was a very uncomfortable, this is checking a lot of red flag boxes for me. And, I come from a Protestant background originally. Now I'm much more traditional, but the issue, but I had never even heard of the Shroud of Turin until this experience. And it kind of soured the whole experience of learning what the Shroud was and what it was all about. And I was really uncomfortable with the whole thing. The picture was very strange. It was totally outside the realm of anything that I was prepared to deal with at that time. And it was just a very alien experience. But me being me, I'm going to verify, I'm going to look into things, I'm going to check it out. So I did. I looked into the Shroud of Turin, and of course, the first thing that I was going to encounter with the Shroud is all of the mainstream media, which immediately discredits the Shroud. They say that it was, not proven, it's not historically verified, there's been carbon-14 dating tests that prove that it was dating somewhere in the 1200s and, the 13th century. The carbon dating says this, and they usually don't outright say, it's been proven to be a forgery. Usually they say, oh, the carbon dating tests prove it to be a forgery. The carbon dating tests say that it was actually from the 13th century, but we'll leave it up to your imagination of whatever you think the Shroud of Turin actually is. Which, naturally, for most of us, and for me, when I first began researching this, I immediately discounted it. I'm like, it's in the blasted encyclopedia right there. They dated it. Obviously there's something crazy going on here, and I think people are blowing this whole situation out of proportion. Well, this turned out to be a complete misunderstanding of the whole situation. Did a little bit more digging and began to be very surprised by the things that I found regarding the Shroud. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Shroud of Turin, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background for it, sort of the Wikipedia of it. The Shroud of Turin first appears in Western consciousness, or in any consciousness by that name, in the 1200s. It was discovered or revealed by noblemen. Let me see. I'm going to pull up the article from Wikipedia, actually, and tell you exactly the names, because it is absolutely fascinating, of Turin. It is fascinating, the history of this thing. So, it originally is mentioned in 1354 exactly. So I was a little bit off on the 1200s. That's why I love double checking and verifying things. It's so helpful. And it was, I love this, the Wikipedia. First mentioned in 1354, the shroud was denounced in 1389 by the local bishop of Troyes as a fake. Like, immediately denounce, fake, false. Currently, the Catholic Church neither formally endorses nor rejects the shroud, and in 2013, Pope Francis referred to it as an icon of a man scourged and crucified. An icon, specifically. The shroud has been kept in the Royal Chapel of the Cathedral of Turin in northern Italy since 1578. And Wikipedia says in 1988, radiocarbon dating established. It's very important that you read that, because we're going to come back to that. Established that the shroud was from the Middle Ages between the years 1260 and 1390, which is where that 1200s number kept sticking in my brain. And all hypotheses put forward to challenge the radiocarbon dating have been scientifically refuted, including the medieval repair hypothesis, the biocontamination hypothesis, and the carbon monoxide hypothesis. The Shroud of Turin is the history of this shroud is supposed to be the burial clothes of Jesus Christ, and it's a 14-foot long piece of linen on which there's an image imprinted. And when you look into the history of it, it first appears in Western consciousness, in the 14th century. It caused a lot of alarms, and then there was this this bishop that denounced it. Well, science is not exactly a consensus of opinion. The whole point of science is that anything can be refuted at any time. And this is one of the few articles of Christian historical, one of the few relics that has ever been undergone. It has really undergone the full rigor of the scientific community. There has been millions of dollars poured into this thing. Eminent scientists from all over the world for decades have been studying this particular Christian artifact. And what's fascinating is the more that they look into the artifact, the less it is possible to disprove the historical validity of the artifact. And it's really funny because every aspect, virtually, of the shroud has been hotly debated in some scientific journal or some press somewhere at one time or another. And the research of this artifact has been done by people who are absolutely critical of the artifact and who are completely pro shroud as being authentic. The research spans the gambit of opinion regarding not only Christianity, not only God himself or itself, the concept of a deity, the concept of moral law, the concept of everything. And all these different scientists have had completely radically different opinions. And there's one work actually that is almost, I would say, foundational that we need to examine in order to really understand this. And I'm going to do a good amount of reading from this work by Frank O. Adams, who wrote this work in Synergy Books, and there's just a ton of reference material in here. And what's absolutely fascinating about the Shroud of Turin is that it's an image that has been somehow imprinted on a cloth, but the image is in the negative, meaning that when you look at the image with the naked eye, it's blurry and indistinct. But when photographers originally took pictures of the shroud, they were allowed to take pictures by the Catholic Church. Is one of the first scientific things that were ever allowed to happen with the shroud. The cameras at that time were all on film, and the photographer originally views this film and realizes that it shows up much better in a negative form. It's basically showing up as white and much more clear. You can see it a lot better. And when we talk about the documented history of this thing, our first exploration, our first introduction, like I said, was in 1389, which was a letter written by a French bishop. The owner of the shroud at that time was the French knight Geoffrey de Charny, and his childless daughter Margaret had kept it after her father's death until 1453, when she gave it to her close friend Anne de Lusignan. I'm never going to pronounce that name correctly. I'm sorry, all of you wonderful French people out there. Who was the wife of the Duke Louis of Savoy, whose family had actually built a whole chapel that was designed to house the shroud. And there was a reliquary, a silver reliquary that was built to house the folded linen, and this was housed in Chambéry in France. And in 1532, a fire in the chapel actually caused some damage to the silver reliquary, as well as some water and heat damage to the relic itself. And in 1578, the shroud was brought to Turin, which is the capital of the House of Savoy. And there in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, it has remained, but where it's been periodically exhibited to folks for, the centuries since. And, there's a ton of people who are very unimpressed with this faint image on flaxen cloth. And, the scientific community in the modern age, not the postmodern age, absolutely dismissed it as a forgery. It looks like a fake. Why is it so faint? Why wouldn't it be clear? What is going on with this stupid thing? Obviously, some medieval artist created this shroud. Well, the Italian photographer Secondo Pla, who was the first one to take the image, basically threw that theory out of, why is it so faint? Well, it was faint because that is going to allow more deception. Because that's the idea. We're thinking, if this is a fake, if it's not a fake, if it is a fake, making the image very faint is going to help with deceiving people into thinking that this item is in fact the burial clothes of Jesus. Well, when the photographer took the photo and showed that the image in the negative is significantly more clear, it comes to life, that basically eliminates that theory. And it poses another problem for people that think that the shroud was a forgery, because if the image is more clear in a manner of with a way of looking at the image that would have been impossible to do in the medieval ages when this thing was supposed to have been a forgery, that is a significant problem, because the artist would have had to have imagined what a negative image would have looked like and then painted it or created it in some way. That's very difficult to stomach in terms of artistic ability, especially when we know what the works of the masters were doing and are and were during that time period. We can measure them against each other. If there was a master artist who was capable of doing something like this, why would he stop at one? What artist stops at one? Okay, so that's an aside. Maybe all the rest of his works were destroyed. Maybe there's no record of him. Maybe he was impaled on a garden stake the instant after his work was created. Maybe all of the leading up to this projects that would be necessary to come up with such a genius idea were also destroyed in a cataclysmic reverse volcano that we have no historical records of. Maybe that happened. But it's a significant problem. So the other issue is so basically there was a whole series of scientific inquiries that happened after this photographer began to reveal that this image was in the negative and showing up so much better. And there was, in 1978, the Shroud of Turin research project created, and we call them the STURP because we love our acronyms, and STURP sounds funny to say. And it wasn't the purpose of the scientific studies to determine whether or not that the burial shroud of Jesus, or that the Shroud of Turin was in fact the burial shroud of Jesus. It was that alone would be basically impossible to prove. So the only thing that they can check for is historic validity. What time period did the shroud originate from, and how was the shroud created? These are the only two questions that the scientific community has attempted to answer. And for 5 days, in a royal suite adjacent to the Turin Cathedral when Stirp was originally created, 24 American scientific and technical personnel, as well as a number of Italians and Swiss criminologists, using 6 tons of the most sophisticated equipment at the time of scientific equipment, subjected the shroud to the most intense scientific and photographic scrutiny possible, short of damaging the cloth. So this was a serious project that originally started. This was the beginning of when they began to examine the shroud. And since then, our scientific inquiries have only gotten better, more detailed, and have shown that it is even more likely that the shroud is authentic. But we will talk about all of that kind of stuff. And if you read the Stirp documentation, you cannot fail to be impressed with the level of detail and effort and energy that they put into making everything accurate and as exhaustive as possible. Read the scientific journals. You will be impressed, I promise you. And, to the naked eye, the shroud is this really mysterious, straw-colored image. And, you can tell it's a picture of a naked man with long hair and who has suffered in tons of torture. You can see damage all over the body when you look at the man. He is, unwashed, bearded. There's bloody wounds on the wrists when you look at this. There's angle of blood flow that they measured, which suggested crucifixion to the scientists. And this is how detailed that they were able to go and study this. They were able to determine cause of death of the individual. Cause of death was asphyxiation, which is consistent with historical records of crucifixion. And, this is established by forensic experts in the field. And, this is not, naked eye anymore. Like, this is fully as scientific, detailed inquiry as you can get. This is Woody from Psych working his magic on a cadaver and saying, yeah, no, this is definitely a cause of death, asphyxiation, right? Additionally, there are strong parallels, they said, from the body, indicating spikes all around the head area, because you can see back and front on the shroud. It's, two halves. You can see the back of the body and the front of the body on the shroud. And you can see that there are peculiar wounds in the face. There's a piercing in the side, which matches the technical specifications of Roman lances. And there is the figure's nose is broken. There's damage to the cheek. The left cheek is swollen. The shoulders are bruised. The information is so complete from the data that they were able to pull from this that the scientists were even able to reconstruct a computer image of what the scourge would have looked like that inflicted the wounds on backs and sides and shoulders of the person that was shown on this shroud. And unsurprisingly, the images that were reproduced by the scientists very closely resemble ancient Roman whips and scourges, and very congruent with 1st century Roman scourges, which have been discovered by modern archaeologists and which were unknown before the 20th century. So, in a quote by Dr. Robert Buckland, who is a STIRB member and forensic pathologist of Los Angeles County, he said the pathology and physiology are unquestionable and represent medical knowledge unknown 150 years ago. And Ian Wilson wrote, if the shroud is the work of an artist. His archaeology was flawless. Very difficult. So in spite of the vastly increased knowledge now, the actual process of how the image was formed remains an enigma, because none of the STURP findings have discredited the image as a fake. So the image is, when we talk about the image, I should mention it's blood. The image on the shroud is blood, so that means that there's biological markers that can be measured. They can tell that the person who died in the shroud had a liver failure from severe trauma, had all these other things that they can tell. These are biological markers that can be checked, and our equipment is just amazing. To go down to the molecular level of a single spot of blood on something. I'd hate to be a criminal in the modern age. You're gonna get caught, man. And the problem is nobody can figure out how the image was formed, because unless because they tested it for paints, they tested it for iron oxide, which I'll get to the iron oxide in a minute, because they used that finding to disprove the shroud, but that has later been disproven. But they would have had to have laid a linen sheet over an actual dead person in order to create this, because they tested for finger painting, they tested for finger rubbing, they tested for brush strokes, they tested for everything that they could think of that a medieval person would have access to, short of airbrushing with a spray gun, which they would not have access to that sort of technology. They can't figure out any way that the image was formed. The only thing that they could think of was, well, it would have had to have laid over a physical dead body. So if there was a forger, he would have had to have access to a dead body that was crucified, scourged, stabbed in the side, beat to a pulp. They would have had to have replicated everything to perfection, as was recorded in the biblical saga of the death of Christ. And then they would have had to have wrapped the body on there, and then they would have had to have soaked the blood into the sheet in a negative. And they can't figure out how that was done. They can't figure it out. Even laying the cloth over a dead body does not produce the same results as this imprint. So it's like they say that something was passed through the cloth, which imprinted the blood into the cloth backwards, inside out, like something had passed through it and left something inside the cloth. And, there's absolutely no science that has disproven this yet. And one of the other issues, too, is a forger would have had to have had perfect knowledge of Roman crucifixion practices, meaning they would have had to have had historical records like what we have today, which that's, first of all, that's a big deal. Who's going to have access to that? Only, the rich and the powerful, who are going to record the things that they do, including the collection of Roman artifacts and bringing them to France in order to create this fake. So that's an aside. But they would have had to have had knowledge of Roman crucifixion practices, which would have been in contrast with the iconography of all crucifixion of Jesus. So when you see an icon of Jesus, you're going to see nails in that palm, meaning that the forger would have had to have gone against the grain of popular Christian belief and showed a damage in the wrist, which would have been necessary to hold up a body in order to remain crucified. You would have had to have pierced through underneath. There's a section that's between two bones, and the nail would sit between those two bones so it wouldn't break any bones. And what's also fascinating, in the shroud, the image shows the thumbs pulled in. Well, the forensic specialists have verified now that damage to this particular tendon area would pull the thumb in of someone who had a spike driven through that particular area, it pulls the thumb in, so your thumbs would be pulled like this. And somehow the forger would have had to have known this. Or crucified someone, which crucified someone in order to forge something. Like, that would be extraordinary if that's your claim. And the fact that there are zero references to any crucifixions of any kind after the Roman era in any country besides the Arabian crucifixions, which looked nothing at all like the Roman crucifixions on a cross. And, you know, the name crucifixion is only slightly related in between the form of Arabic crucifixion and the form of Roman crucifixion. And there's debate about which one is more painful. But probably it's Roman. So, you know, there are zero presence of... So that's the first one. So there are also zero presences of artists' pigments in the cloth. And then, you know, there's the other issue of how did the blood get on there, right? So how did it get in there backwards? If an artist had done this, there's no evidence at all of tampering. Tampering in the creation of the shroud. The other thing that would have had to have happened is they've dated the cloth to the 1st century and to Palestine. So the forger would have had to have obtained cloth from the 1st century, which I'm not sure that there's a lot of that lying around, especially in such large quantities as a 14-foot sheet. But they would have had to have obtained perfectly preserved cloth from the 14th century and not have damaged it in any of their medieval handling practices. And they would have had to have, because, you know, the scientists that study this sort of thing, archaeologists that study this, can verify the date and the location of virtually any cloth that has been manufactured in any time period from any place in the world. The science for this stuff is really good now. It's really very, very good. And, you know, so then we have the issue of that a lot of people claim had disproven the shroud, which was the famous memorandum of Bishop Pierre d'Arcis in 1389. Don't make fun of me for my pronunciations. In this letter, he addressed to Pope Clement the 7th at Avignon, and he mentioned that in 1357, his predecessor, the Bishop of Troyes, Henry of Poitiers, had prohibited the exhibition of the shroud, and that according to the same Bishop Henry, an artist had confessed to having painted the cloth, quote, to wit that it was a work of human skill and not miraculously wrought or bestowed. And on this basis, D'Arcis, it's D''A''R''C''I''S, D'Arcis, we'll go with that, asked that the Pope put a stop to these exhibitions, which were drawing hundreds of pilgrims to Lieri, and banned them once and for all. And for centuries, this particular letter was routinely accepted as conclusive evidence that proved that the Shroud of Turin was a fake. But even the most severe critics of the shroud have to admit that D'Arcis gives no evidence whether or not there was an investigation that took place, or whether or not that the alleged confession that had been given to his predecessor a century ago had been proven as genuine. And he does not even give the name of the supposed artist, nor does any mention of the proceedings appear in any of the history annals of that period. And this is really unusual because the medievals, contrary to popular belief, were obsessed with documenting and detailing their endeavors and the things that they did. And when you start to look into who these people were, D'Arcis, it's probably like Archis, successor in the See of Troyes, the Bishop Louis Ragnon, these French words, believed the shroud to be genuine and permitted its open veneration. So you have to wonder when you're looking at this if D'Arcis was even describing the same object, or and in fact, there's actually reason to suspect that the memo was referring to a copy of the original shroud. And that did happen quite a bit with relics. Relics were often copied and faked. And when only hundreds of people are coming to see this super important relic in comparison with probably the thousands that the actual shroud would be generating in terms of pilgrimages, the numbers don't add up, and the historical record doesn't add up, and it seems more like this letter was actually referring to a forgery of the Shroud of Turin. So, but that's one theory, which is very likely. But there's an even more likely possibility, which is true, that Diarchis claimed that the image had been cunningly painted, but Diarchis was locked in mortal confrontation with the owners of the shroud, which were the Dicharni family. And the Dicharni family were at that moment, the moment that the letter was written, they were successfully challenging Diarchis' authority in the diocese. And motives should never be taken out of a criminal proceeding, which is essentially what a claim of fraud is. If you're claiming that it's a forgery, that's a criminal thing to do. So in a court of law, they're never going to dismiss motivation. Ever. Like, that doesn't happen. Like, motivation is one of the most important parts of evidence. So, taken on its own merits, the memorial of Pierre Diarchis is untrustworthy. And Clement VIII, actually, in his rescript to Dicharmi and to his final decree, he declared that Pierre Diarchis was angry with his opponents for obtaining an indult to exhibit the shroud without his permission, and he was still more angry with them when they ignored his command to withdraw the shroud from public veneration and invoked the intervention of the king, which prevented him from taking action against them. So, he was hurt and humiliated, Diarchis was, when Clement VII upheld his opponents and put him under silence in the rescript to the layman Dicharni, because Diarchis was a bishop, and this was outrageous to his sense of personal dignity and pride. And when he was put under the rescript of Dicharni, who was, not clergy, this was a censure by the Pope of Diarchis. And Diarchis' memorial, when you read it, it's this violent outburst of grievances and is a piece of special pleading in his own defense. He's so intemperate in his language when you read this thing that, and he's so bitter in his animus that, and reckless even in his accusations, that you can't help but think that this person or somebody was guilty. One of the two parties is guilty of the meanest fraud. And his unsupported statement as a political agent in this situation of power cannot be underestimated. So, we have two theories right here that very easily invalidate the letter by Diarchis. Very easily invalidate it. So, take, the letter saying that it was a fraud, well, that's very serious, but there were serious objections. There are serious objections to Dicharni's claim. And, before we enter, into a discussion, of, whether or not the shroud is totally authentic, we have to ask whether or not the blood itself was faked, because, that's a possibility. So the Stirp Committee, when they tested it, made a statement. They wanted to determine a few things. One, they wanted to see if there were signs of pigments, dyes, stains, powders, acids, or other artificial or natural colorants on the cloth. Two, was there any evidence for the presence of a medium to apply said pigment? Three, are there any signs of an artist's work at hand, brushstrokes, block prints, or finger rubbing? We already talked about this. And four, could a duplicate be made of the image that demonstrates all of the known characteristics of the image and still falls within the technical ability of a forger who lived between the 1st and the 14th centuries. Meaning that, well, maybe they forged this much earlier than when it originally appears and is documented in 1389 or whatever that year was. Or what, was it originally forged in the 6th century? We want to know. And the scientific evidence cited, by those that believe the shroud to be the work of an artist is primarily based on the testimony of Dr. Walter McCrone. He was a STURP member. He was an eminent microanalyst, and he achieved renown in 1974 when he unmasked the Yale Vinland map, which was thought to be a 14th century work as a fake. So that's what he does. And McCrone and his work has been heavily cited by scientific journals all around the world for a long period of time as proof that the shroud was a fake. And what he did is he examined a number of sticky tape slides which contained samples of fibrils from the shroud. And McCrone declared that he had found a high incidence of iron oxide. I mentioned this before because it's important. And that this iron oxide was a hematite, which is otherwise known as a earth pigment, which has been used since prehistoric times in making the paint. And on this basis, he concluded basically that the shroud was a work of a clever artist, using a thin watercolor, which explained the lack of brushstrokes and why the image was so blurry. And as soon as he published this work, as part of the STURP committee, his work blew up. Everybody's checking it out. Everybody is quoting him. It's almost like people were rabid to disprove it, which, I get it. You want to see whether or not something's valid. So much easier to just say, oh, all this is a fake. None of this is real. It's so much easier to destroy something than it is to create something. Okay, I get it. But when McCrone presented his findings to the rest of the STURP team, the other members were dismayed by certain failures. And, and everyone questioned the validity of his results because, the precise nature in any one sample and its relevance, this is what they said, as a contributor to specific forms of the various images seen on parts of the cloth. This was the objection that they had. But McCrone had arrived at his conclusions independently of the rest of the team. He used his microanalyst skills separately. He came up with this, finding of the iron oxides, and, he published it, and he, claimed from then on that the work was a forgery. And the rest of the STURP team and then other scientists later on, basically were working on McCrone's theory to test whether his theory was accurate. And they found that they found that there was iron oxide in the sticky tape. So when the sticky tape was removed from the microanalysis, the iron oxide theory disappeared. Gone. And now McCrone even admits, well, okay, yeah, you were right. I was wrong. There was no iron oxide. It wasn't an issue of a thin watercolor, which also doesn't explain the negative image or or where the image is imprinted in the cloth specifically in terms of the depth. It's inside the cloth as opposed to, on one side or the other. And, and when you look at his tests for, birefringence and the particles, it's like quite obviously paint. Well, his test determined to be a false, was determined to be false, and McCrone eventually retracted his conclusion. He admitted that he had neglected to compare results from different areas of the shroud, and he added that his information was not as precise as one would like, in his own words, which is like, okay, why did you bother if you weren't going to be precise? But by this point, the history of the shroud has been damaged. The validity of the shroud has been damaged in the public mind, which frankly, the public mind was already looking for an excuse not to believe in it. We have to be honest here. And, these were, and the paint that he detected, was just all in that little sticky tape. And as soon as you remove the sticky tape, it went away. So then there was another issue too, which was this person by the name of Joe Nickel, who claimed that the image was a fake. He was an experimenter at the University of Kentucky and a former magician. And he had made a name for himself when he wrote about his experiment in the magazine Popular Photography. And his theory was that the Turin image was a result of a dry powder of myrrh and aloes brushed onto a cloth and stretched over a bas relief figure, stretched over basically the shape of a man, so they didn't actually have to literally crucify someone in order to make a piece of art. And he was able to show that indeed a kind of image can be produced on cloth by this method, which simulated some of the characteristics of the Turin shroud, but there were, this would be another major objection. Unfortunately for Nickel, his technique required significant buildup of particles in the image area, which something that does not show up in the microscopic inspection and of the actual Shroud of Turin. Additionally, and this is amazing, the fire and water that came into contact during the Shroud of 1532 would have significantly affected an image formed with organic substances. Dramatically affected it. And this did not happen with the Turin cloth, although it otherwise shows clear evidence of heat scorching and watermarks because it went through a fire. Actually, I think 2 fires, including the one that I mentioned earlier. But, then there were the aesthetic objections to Nickel's practice, which, Nickel's image shows nothing of the clarity and resolution of the shroud. Nickel's image was all blurry, crude, a very poor job replicating it, and his his image didn't do any of the 3D conformation that the computer imaging of the shroud gives us and lets us see, which provides one of the most striking arguments against the shroud being a fraud, by the way. Furthermore, Nickel claims that the rubbing heat technique he had tried to duplicate was common in the art of the Middle Ages, but we have zero record whatsoever of any rubbing techniques like this being used anywhere in the world prior to the modern age. So, and we have scientists that measure art historians that can look into this, and they did look into this and they said, no, they didn't have this at all. This is ridiculous. Basically, the Nickel objection was disproven, and fairly easily. When you look at the 2 images side by side, you're like, yeah, that's not even close, bro. Like, this is pathetic, your attempt to do this. Like, you thought that this was good enough to publish publicly? Like, that's terrible. And then they had another theory that the image was produced by heating a metal statue, then applying a cloth, and it would be slightly scorched by appropriate places. They thoroughly investigated this idea, this hypothesis of how the image could have been formed. Totally not. It never would have worked. Scorches fluoresce under ultraviolet light, but the image of the Shroud of Turin does not. No fluorescing under ultraviolet light at all. So that theory was thrown out of the bucket entirely. So you would think that a piece of linen surviving from 2,000 years, first of all, like, how could that ever happen? But archaeologists find pieces of linen twice that old from Egypt all of the time too. So the theory that, well, the linen itself was a fake, well, it's not. It's been proven, like I mentioned earlier. It's proven that that the linen itself is authentic 1st century Palestinian production linen. And basically, if the other issue with this is expert surgeons have examined forensic experts that examine cadavers for a living have examined the body, and they have found that there's a level of detail hidden underneath and inside and behind things that you wouldn't expect that perfectly correlate to exactly what would happen to a real body. So that, again, the only way to produce the Shroud of Turin is to kill a man and cover his body with this cloth. So, you know, it's impossible to believe that it was the result merely of an artist, unless we're talking about a fantasy artist that plays with dead bodies. Literally, like, that's your theory, that somebody that evil existed and had enough resources and backing to literally Frankenstein this Shroud of Turin. And, you know, what also validates the history of the Shroud of Turin that we have to talk about, which is the historical aspect. The Shroud was not even a part of the property of the Catholic Church until 1983. So it couldn't have been an official forgery, which the resources to crucify someone and then cover it up are astronomical. Like, you know, well, you know, it's easy to create a conspiracy theory that, well, somebody disappeared in the middle of the night and some crazy scientist had him wrapped up in his basement and crucified him. Like, the level of details and likelihood that you would be caught is so high trying to do something like that, especially in a day when everybody knows everybody. And if you're creepy and weird like that, people generally know. Plus, basements aren't that easy to come by. Plus, the world, the framework, the social framework was much more personal and relational then. A servant would have found it if it was in the house of a rich man, and then the servant would have had to have been killed. Then the family of the servant is now wondering what happened to my family member. You would have to kill so many people to cover up this crime that it would blow your mind, because somebody's going to find out. You know, first of all, where are you getting your dead person? It can't be a public execution because the outcry for that would be extraordinary. It can't be a public execution because documentation of public executions is detailed. It can't be a public execution in the manner of a crucifixion because the Christian community would have totally found that to be unacceptable, completely unacceptable. You can't do that. So it had to have been a murder. It would have to have been clandestine. It would have had to have been secret. There could have been a cabal involved. But the difficulty with cabals is that most of the time somebody confesses on their deathbed. It's extremely rare for a group of people to take a murder to the grave. Extremely rare. So, you know, potentially there's a cabal of people. But the motivations to do that, what are you going to gain? You know, you have the Shroud of Turin. You're not going to gain revenue from this because pilgrims aren't like the tourists of today. They don't come in and spend a ton of money. They bring their own food. Yeah, sure, they'll buy from some local merchants, but they're not paying you to come. There's no toll tax, you know, for most pilgrimages. And in fact, taxing the pilgrims was illegal in a large portion of the world. So, you know, in terms of actual motivations of what you're going to get out of this, first of all, the idea of discovering the burial or of forging the burial shroud around somebody is, you know, first of all, it's kind of disturbing. It's totally disturbing. The whole idea of forging it with an actual literal dead body is terrifyingly disturbing. Yeah, sure, it's possible, but unlikely to the highest possible degree. And, you know, the other issue is, you know, in terms of history, okay, well, it would have had to have been the family, the DeCharny family, that is forging this thing, but none of the family members have mentioned anything about this heinous act that happened in the past. Nobody felt guilty about it. Nobody talked to a father confessor. Nobody, you know, if you're extremely Catholic enough to think that the creation of the shroud is going to somehow benefit you and you're not going to go to confession, which is required. So it's just, it's mind-bogglingly insane, the level of logistics that would be necessary to pull off a secret crucifixion in the middle of modern France, which, it would have been modern to them. And it's not like they didn't have detectives then. Somebody disappears, people go looking. They don't just, somebody disappeared. I don't know where Joe went. Guess I'm going to go cut some hay. People are people. Nobody just says, yep, somebody disappeared. Can't imagine where it went, but dude's been acting super creepy, and there's a new grave. Where did that come from? Maybe he buried him in the woods. Carrying a dead body around is extremely difficult. Yeah, it's possible. It's incredible. It's absolutely possible, but so unlikely it is almost impossible to imagine that it could be possible. So, when we talk about, so we have to talk about the carbon-14 dating. There was an issue where, all of this stuff had been done. Stirp had tested all of these things. They didn't want to test carbon dating because carbon dating destroys the thing that it tests. You submit it to an extreme amount of radiation. It does a ton of damage, and you really don't want to have to do that. So eventually, the Shroud had received permission. The Keepers of the Shroud, which is now the Catholic Church, gave permission for the Shroud to be analyzed, and they determined that the Shroud had been dated from, it came about in the 12th century. So people were like, well, all of these other scientific things that, have proven that it was valid, that it was a real, relic dating from the 1st century. Well, the carbon dating method has basically disproven this. Well, not so fast. Remember how I said earlier that there has been a desire to disprove the validity of the Shroud of Turin? Well, apparently, the carbon-14 dating was done by several different laboratories that, they independently... This is amazing. They independently measured the Shroud, and they determined, according to our dating methods, this is a fake. It was originally from the 12th century, despite every evidence to the contrary. And then they refused to submit the results of their finding. They refused to show what data was used to produce these results. They refused to say anything else about the details of their work whatsoever. Well, people have a serious vested interest in the Shroud now. I mean, there's whole, organizations put around the idea of studying this thing. I mean, there's scientists like Dr. Liberto Di Caro from Italy's Institute of Crystallography, who spent 30 years studying the Shroud of Turin. He's dedicated his life to studying the Shroud. There is a ton of work. And so scientists were like, you got to show us the results of your test. You can't just tell us, yes, it dated from this time. Like, we're scientists. We know how to read a carbon-14 dating test. You need to give us the details. Well, they refused. All 3 of these institutions refused. And it took a Freedom of Information, so this was American labs had studied this, and it took a Freedom of Information Act to force these institutions to show their data. And when they showed their data, which they had claimed with 95% confidence that the Shroud dated from only 1260 to 1390 AD, and this is teams from Oxford, from the University of Arizona, and from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Major organizations. They were found to have contaminated their data with 16th century cloth. They had used cloth from the Shroud of Turin and cloth from completely different sources, 16th century linen, in order to skew the findings. And it worked. They firmly discredited the Shroud of Turin in the public mind. and they were lying. You know, I wanted to say it nicely. I intended to say it nicely, but when we're talking about science, science has an extraordinary impact when published in a journal on the public mind. And if scientists are comfortable lying about something like this, that doesn't even necessarily prove that this was Jesus' burial shroud, it's just a burial shroud. When you have scientists actively willing to lie about this, that is a major problem for public perception. You can't just say, oh yeah, we're, open and honest, trust the science, bro. No, I don't trust the science. Show me your work. I want to know. There's a reason why we are skeptical. We're skeptical of the skeptics. And, so there has been other work that has been done in terms of the science for measuring this thing. So they recently, they tested the fibers from the shroud using wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXIS method. And what this method does is it examines the natural aging of the cellulose that constitutes the linen of the investigated sample. And the findings from Dr. DeCaro, who used the WAXIS method, published on April 11th of 2022, I believe, notes that the testing results of the thread sample taken from the shroud was fully compatible with the analogous measurements obtained on a linen sample, whose dating, according to historical records, is 55 through 74 AD, siege of Masada, meaning that the same aging. So this WAXIS method measures the degradation of cloth. It's an entire science dedicated to measuring the degradation of cloth to determine age. And we have a piece of cloth whose historicity we can absolutely verify. This piece of cloth dated from 55 to 74 AD from the siege of Masada. The Shroud of Turin's aging, the cloth from the siege of Masada's aging, completely compatible. So the WAXIS method is very reliable in determining the cellulose aging in linen. So, this issue of, carbon dating thrown out the window. We have another method, WAXIS dating, which is very good, by the way. They have verified, okay, so this comes from the 1st century, very near 1st century, as close as we can get it. But there's another thing that the Shroud of Turin has, which is not easily checked, which is that there is unexplainable 3D distance information, which resembles a topographical map of Christ's body, or of the body, as well as elements resembling the negative photographic image, which I mentioned. And the image does not penetrate the shroud's fabric, but only sits on the top, which makes no sense whatsoever logically. If it was blood, everybody knows if you pour a liquid onto a piece of fabric, it soaks all the way through. But an image sitting on top of the fabric and stopping there, but remaining, makes no sense. It's unexplainable. Nobody has ever been able to replicate doing this. So I mentioned that you'd have to have a crucified body. The other thing that you'd have to do is somehow get the blood not to penetrate the cloth, but to remain perfectly on top of the cloth as almost like a separate entity, but fused to the cloth itself, which nobody knows how to do that, not even with our modern technology. And the WAXIS research found that 100% this 2,000 year it's 2,000 years old. It's follows all of the historical traditions that we would expect to see, and then they even measured molds and bacteria which colonize on textile fibers and dirt or carbon minerals, which this is from DeCaro's research, from his paper. So he said molds and bacteria colonizing textile fibers and dirt or carbon-containing minerals such as limestone, adhering them to the empty spaces between the fibers that at a microscopic level represent about 50% of the volume, can be so difficult to completely eliminate in the sample cleaning phase, which could distort the dating. He's talking about the carbon dating method. And this shows why, another reason why these institutes that use the carbon dating method totally failed in trying to be accurate. So, and in contrast, the Waxis allows us to confirm the sheet, he says. And the it provides another piece of the puzzle for veracity for this shroud. And his work has all been peer-reviewed, evaluated by 3 other independent experts, as well as the editor of Heritage. So it has been totally peer-reviewed, unlike the other, debunking scientific research that was not peer-reviewed. It was not even allowed to be analyzed by other scientists until Freedom of Information Acts came out. The other one, when he was finally, with the iron oxide, when he was finally peer-reviewed, that showed up to be fake as well. So peer reviewing is essential before any journal articles should ever be published. Like, it should be like, you should never publish something without peer reviewing it. But they do all the time. And it's obnoxious. So, as far as, the characteristics of the image, they're so unique that it would be impossible for the image to have been made in 1260 through 1390 because the technology did not exist and still does not exist. Remember how I said the image is laying on top of the fabric? Nobody knows how to make this. The technology, even in our modern world, even if you airbrushed it on, artists today with their airbrushes you could produce amazing things. They cannot replicate what happened here, not even with real blood. So, all modern attempts to produce an image of the face that is macroscopically and microscopically correct using only the materials and abilities available to the people in the Middle Ages have also failed. So, there was another researcher, Joseph Marino, who recently published an 800-page book which detailed the numerous questionable actions, errors, and contradictions regarding the carbon-14 dating methods. He also verified that that these carbon dating methods were absolute bunk. They refused to release the information, and but it's fascinating because these historians all try to debunk the Shroud of Turin. So basically, the only thing that we can really figure is that there are people with a vested interest in debunking the Shroud of Turin. For some reason, they hate it and they want it to go away. That is the only reason why they would continually publish these salacious, unproven works. Or they just like publishing garbage, salacious works that get them likes. There's also that possibility. If it increases your viewer count, all publicity is good publicity, even bad publicity. So there's that level, which is, immoral on another level, but regardless. But there's one more thing that we got to check, which is the historicity of the shroud, because they say, well, why is there no, historical record of the shroud if this is such an important artifact? Then there should be a documented historical, record that we can look at. Why was it only showing up in the 1300s? That doesn't make sense. Like, this should be like one of the most important Christian artifacts that have ever existed. And the answer to that is, yeah, there should be a historical record. And there is. There are sprinklings of mentions to this to this shroud. It's called it by some different names, and when you actually look into what those names mean, you can trace them back to a description of what would be appropriately termed for the shroud or burial clothes. Obviously, the Greek words would have been different from the Latin words as we get older, but the early references to a burial shroud are all obviously in Greek because that's what the early Christians were speaking. So, there are, for example, the Saint Jerome, who translated the Latin translated the scriptures into Latin, actually quote a piece from the lost Gospel of the Hebrews, which says that the burial sheet of the Lord was given to someone by the Lord himself. So, that's our first reference here. And in the life of the 4th century enlightener of Georgia, Saint Nina, she said that the Lord's shroud came into her possession first of Saint Luke and then of Saint Peter, but during her time she did not know where it was. So, whether or not, the Shroud of Turin was specifically the burial clothes, maybe we don't really know, but what else would it be, right? So, there may have been a different set of burial clothes. It's possible. So, we have to talk about this. There was a 7th century Western bishop that said that he did not know where the Lord's shroud was. He said, "Yet I do not think that the apostles neglected to preserve these and such like relics for future times." And in fact, St. John Damascene, in his 3rd apology against the iconoclasts, lists the winding sheet among those created things by which God has accomplished our salvation and which are thereby accorded veneration. In relation, to these Shroud of Turin, we have a reference in the ancient Mozarabic liturgy used by Christians of Muslim Spain, which is preserved to this day in the Diocese of Toledo. Additionally, in the services for Great and Holy Saturday, it speaks of Peter and John seeing fresh traces or vestigia on the linen of the one dead and risen, seeing the fresh traces. And this is a fascinating reference to the Shroud of Turin because it's, the fresh traces on the linen of the one dead and risen, that speaks to an image appearing on the actual linen. And that was from the ancient Mozarabic liturgy. And beginning in the year 570, we find more references. So we're sort of, starting later and working our way back here. We find more references to the linen associated with the Lord's Sepulchre. Various pilgrims at different times and different places attest to having been shown either the sindon or the sudarion, which related, these were our Greek words related to the burial clothes that I mentioned earlier. In the 11th century, the Byzantine Emperor Alexis Comnenus, in a letter to Robert of Flanders, mentions that among the most precious relics in his possessions were the burial linens found in the tomb after the resurrection. This receives curious confirmation in the catalogue of Constantinople's relics compiled in 1157 by the superior of an Icelandic monastery, Nicholas Somundarson, I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, which lists the bloody shroud of Christ specifically. And in 1171, William of Tyre wrote that the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus showed the Frankish king Amalric I of Jerusalem the most precious evidence of the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, that is the cross, nails, lance, sponge, reed, crown of thorns, sindon, there's that word again, and sandals. A more detailed description is provided by the Greek Nicholas Mesarites, who was guardian of the relics for the emperor who saved the shroud from fire during an uprising of the guards in 1201. In this, he said, in this chapel, Christ rises again, and the sindon, there's that word again, with the burial linens as the clear proof, the burial sindon of Christ, this is of linen, of cheap and easily obtainable material, still smelling fragrant of myrrh, defying decay because it wrapped the mysterious naked body after the Passion. That's that burial rite where the women are anointing, or the Jewish practice is anointing the bodies of the deceased with these anointing oils, including myrrh. And there's another intriguing statement from the Crusader Robert di Chiari. In 1203, he saw in the church of the Blachernay in Constantinople the Sindoin, it's that word again, in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood straight every Friday so that the figure of the Lord could be plainly seen there. And scholars say that the medieval French word for fiori could be interpreted either as face or full figure, which in itself is an intriguing suggestion, as we will see below, but de Clary added that no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of this Sindoin after the city was taken by the Crusaders. And in trying to answer that question, we have to follow the lead of Geoffrey de Villehardouin, who was a reliable historian and leader of the Fourth Crusade. And he relates that a general of the 6th Burgundian Division, the knight Othan de la Roche, saved the shroud from being divided in the course of plunder, which that would have been a travesty, and took it to his native Burgundy in 1206. With his father, Ponce de la Roche, an aristocrat of the neighboring Franche-Comté. He presented the Holy Shroud to Archbishop Amadeus, who placed it in the Besançon Cathedral. And according to the cathedral records, manuscript number 826, the shroud was brought out annually on Pascha for veneration until 1349, in which year it was stolen. Soon thereafter, the shroud came into the possession of King Philip du Valois, who in turn gave it to his standard-bearer, Knight and Count of Liray, Geoffrey de Charny, in gratitude for his services. And now we come full circle. Geoffrey de Charny, we have mentioned earlier, the de Charny name we have mentioned earlier. De Charny was given the relic with the understanding that it would be treasured in the church he intended to build in Liry. And in fact, a decree issued by Pope Clement VII in 1390 mentions that the shroud was reverently placed at Liry by de Charny. And so we have a very clear Western record of the Crusaders and the Western Christians seeing the shroud in Constantinople, apparently being impressed. And when the Crusaders conquered and sacked Constantinople, we have a record of the shroud being taken from Constantinople to France, where it eventually ended up in the modern mind with the de Charny family and the power struggle between de Charny and the Archbishop de Écurie. Oh, I'm so bad with names. I literally just read it like 8 times today, but we'll get there. While this historian Butakov, who is very reliable, we think, is carefully referenced with footnotes to many original sources, there's another theory which is proposed by an Oxford scholar, Hungarian Dr. Csocssan, Kasaxan de Varalia, who suggests that the shroud was taken from Constantinople by Mary, the widow of Emperor Isaac II Angelus. The Hungarian-born empress had married the man who led the sack of Constantinople, Boniface de Montferrat, taking the name Margaret in Roman baptism. So there's 2 ideas of where the shroud could have come from. Both have historical validity. So we do know for sure that, there's this issue of records that say only the Holy Face and some records that say the shroud itself. And we do know that there were holy cloths in reliquaries in Constantinople. We know that they disappeared along with other relics during the sack of 1201. And we know that there was a short time later, after this sacking, that many of these relics began to pop back up in the West. But one of the big objections is why aren't there any feasts associated with the shroud in the Orthodox Church? Because the Orthodox are often creating whole festivals and feast days and things associated with these relics. Why wouldn't it show up in the Eastern tradition? And the answer is, that it does. It shows up in the services for Great and Holy Friday, which is the only appropriate day to, celebrate something that is related to Christ's death, not related to his burial, or not related to his resurrection, not related to his life. It's specifically related to his death and burial, which means that it can only be associated with Great and Holy Friday. So, and it's mentioned in the services of Great and Holy Friday. But, when we're talking about more of the Orthodox tradition, we even have a case recorded by Eusebius of Caesarea around 325, and who is, Eusebius is regarded by secular scholars as quite reliable. He said the king of Edessa, Abgar V, received one of the 70 disciples mentioned in the scripture, and he had brought with him Mandilion, which healed the king of his disease, thus inspiring Abgar to convert to Christianity. This disciple then also converted the people of Edessa, and a subsequent persecution caused the image of the Lord, not made by human hands, as it was called, to be bidden and then eventually forgotten or lost. In any case, pilgrims who visited the city, and even St. Ephraim the Syrian, who lived in Edessa in the 4th century, did not mention it. So it was mentioned in 325, and by the 4th century, it's gone again. But in the 6th century, the Mandilion, which is the image not made by human hands, that's what that word refers to, it had been found again. It had been hidden. It was bricked up in an arch over one of the city gates. And copies were made, and many were touched to the original before being sent to churches elsewhere, much as was done with the Shroud of Turin in the Middle Ages. Remember, copies being made. But these are copies, and you can tell the copy because it's made by human hands, and we know how these copies were made. Paintings, dusts, finger paintings, water paintings, there's many different methods by which these artists recreated these shrouds, and there's a very famous icon in the Orthodox tradition of the face of Jesus on a cloth, and this would be considered a reproduction of what is probably the Shroud of Turin. But it's a painting. You can tell, like, it's not meant to be an exact one-to-one replica. It's meant to replicate the idea of the actual shroud. It's not meant to be the shroud in perfect photographic reproduction. That's not what the purpose of the Orthodox iconography is. So, there are no eyewitness, and after 4 centuries of veneration in Edessa, it was moved to the Church of Blachernae in Constantinople. So, this would have been, quite a long time after the shroud had appeared in Edessa. So, we have this historical record all the way dating from, the 1st centuries, 4th centuries, the 3rd centuries, and, so we have very early mention of this, and then we have tons of new mentions in the 12th century, which have all kinds of descriptions of the cloth. They say that the Mandilion had imprinted on it the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his whole body. So, that would be a record before it shows up in Europe at all. And, so 12th century, that's, 1100s, before the sack of Constantinople. So, we also have a 6th century text which refers to the Mandilion as a tetradiplon, which is doubled in 4, which is a very curious choice of words, and it's important to remember because when there's many mentions of the Holy Face, and we found that the Shroud of Turin had actually been folded up so that just the face could be seen, and for centuries people believed that that was the only thing that was on this shroud at all. And there's creases in the shroud that show this, that can be, it's been folded in one position for 400 years. The creases don't iron out, and you can find these things. And, we have many more references to the Holy Face from ancient history. And, in the 11th century, we have a lot more, now that it's been in the official Church of Constantinople. We have icons in the 6th century, which, show Jesus, nothing to do with Romans at all. It looks just like the image of the shroud. You should see the Orthodox images. They are very interesting. They don't show quite as large of facial hair, but, all the same facial features are there. And remember, icons are not meant to be one-to-one. They're never meant to be photographic. That's not the purpose. But we do absolutely have a historical record of the shroud dating back all throughout the history of the church, all throughout the history of mankind since the 1st century. So, people say, well, the historical record isn't conclusive. That's fair. When your image was bricked up in an arch for a couple centuries, that tends to provide gaps in your historical record. I mean, I can't even imagine finding a relic bricked up into an arch. Like, how did you find that? Some workman's repairing this arch, and what did I just find? That's insane. So all of this stuff together that we've talked about today, we've gone super in depth into the mystery of the Shroud of Turin. They can't replicate it. In terms of conclusions, can we say definitively that the Shroud of Turin is 100% the shroud of Jesus Christ? The burial clothes, that's the image of Jesus? Maybe not. But that's just the skeptic in me talking. All of the evidence points to its historical veracity. All of the evidence. And there isn't any serious objection left that has not been covered. So if you start hearing people talk about the Shroud of Turin as a fake, it means that they have bought into these institutions, these scientists, which have obscured the truth, whether intentionally, not intentionally, whether or not they had an agenda. Who knows? I mean, we know, but we're going to say who knows to be a little bit more gentle than I normally am. But the shroud itself, whether or not it's actually Jesus' body, we don't really know. We do know that he looks very similar to a lot of ancient iconography that we have. We do know that mentions of the Holy Face were all over. There were, the mentions of the shroud are in the services that date to the 3rd century of the Orthodox liturgy of Great and Holy Friday. But, we can't 100% prove it. That's science. Science can never 100% prove anything. They can't even prove to you that the Earth is orbiting around the sun. They could just tell you, well, until we think of something, until we disprove it, we're going to believe it, because that's how science works. So all of the historical evidence points to historicity. There's no reason to doubt it. From my perspective, after doing all of this research, I knew nothing about the Shroud of Turin until I started doing all of this research. Nothing at all. And after doing all of this, I'm convinced. I cannot see any reason why anybody would logically try to disprove it, or would logically say, no, that's not the Shroud of Turin. How did the image get there? We have no idea. We can't replicate it in any possible way with modern methods, ancient methods. We have no idea how the image got there. How did they get a dead body to do this from the 1st century? Another issue I mentioned, they found pollen from Palestine on this cloth. So if it was forged in the, in France, they would have had to have brought in pollen from Palestine. Does that prove anything? Maybe not. But it proves it. Then they brought in pollen, there's no paint strokes. It would have to have been 100% a dead body. They would have had to have been able to hide the dead body from everyone. They would have been able to hide the mystery. They would have had to have, hide all documentation, burn all documents. Almost in every case of every murder ever, the murderer keeps some sort of memorabilia for his action. There's always proof somewhere. All of that's gone. And nobody reports a missing body. The shroud suddenly appears. The artist maybe kills somebody and then waits 2 centuries to do it so that the outcry from the murdered family, or for the family members of the murdered person, can't be associated with this evil thing that you have done. So there would have to be this enormous separation, and all of a sudden you show up, this picture, because remember, it's a picture, so anybody that would have known the dead person would be like, I know him. That was Frank. You killed Frank and put his picture on there. How did you do that? Like, you're not going to get away with this. There's no way that you're going to be able to randomly crucify somebody, have nobody recognize this. Pilgrims are coming from all over the world, and nobody recognizes him. So therefore, it just doesn't make sense. The crucifixion theory, the crucifixion as a fraud theory, which is beyond bonkers, like no scientist would even entertain, no historian would even entertain the possibility, because it's so outlandish. And it's the only explanation. They cannot think of anything better other than that. Insanity. So at this point, I would say the Shroud of Turin it has a 95% chance of 100% being the actual burial clothes of Jesus Christ, or of someone who was crucified in the 1st century, and that was important enough to save his burial clothes for 2,000 years. Yeah, that one makes even less sense than the sneaky crucifixion forgery theory. And whose image miraculously appeared on these burial clothes, which never happened before. We have no records ever of these images appearing, and the image appeared in a negative. We have no idea how the image ever appeared. There's no way that this thing is a forgery. There's no way. 5% chance it's a forgery. 5%. Tops. Otherwise, Shroud of Turin, not debunked. Proven. From all of the scientific research. So thanks for jumping on the traditional press with me today. We did a little bit something different today. We checked out the historicity of an item. We went super deep into this shroud, but I found it to be absolutely fascinating. I found the controversy swirling around it to be even more fascinating. If you enjoyed this episode, pop a like for me. I would tremendously appreciate it. It helps a ton to get a few likes. A ton. I'm a very small channel. I can't grow without you. So hang out with me again sometime. Loved having you here. Thanks for checking out the Shroud of Turin with me. I'll catch you all next time. Podcast. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more traditional ideas and exploration of the why behind the what.